Working on early childhood programs 25 years ago, which was very near the beginning of my research on the impacts of early childhood programs. It's also a great pleasure to have followed Dr. Barnett and Dr. Norris and their excellent presentations. So we really have a wonderful team working here on the research. I'm going to talk about, you've heard about early childhood in Colombia, the returns on investment here. You've heard about our study. And I want to talk more generally about why it's important to do evaluations, why it's important to do this kind of research on investments in early childhood development. We have a very large body of research internationally on early childhood programs, going back at least 50 years, very strong research, and some studies that go back much further than that. And I think we have very clear evidence now that early childhood programs, from hundreds of studies, that early childhood programs can have substantial impact on children's learning and development. And the question is, more recently been, but what are the long-term consequences of that? Sure, we know you can improve children at least in the short term, but what about the long term? We have now about 25 or 30 studies from around the world, many of them, but not all of them, from the United States, that look at least beyond, at least well into primary school and often into secondary school and beyond. And we see a very consistent pattern across these studies that investments in early education in particular have substantial impacts on children's achievement test scores, on the need for special education and grade repetition, that is, whether children fail a grade and have to repeat, on whether they complete secondary school, on behavior problems at home and in the community, delinquency and crime, on their employment and earnings as adults, and whether they're dependent on government for financial support or whether they can maintain their independence financially, and on whether they engage in risky behaviors like smoking or drug use, and also on their mental health. So, for example, the likelihood that they become clinically depressed. Now, all of these things are important for the children we invest in, for their communities, but they also are important to government, because the reverse of the benefits of these are costs to government. So much of this is cost savings to government. And so if we ask, why should government invest in these beyond the good that it does for the children? And where is the money going to come from to pay for it? I think the answer is we're already paying for not doing these investments. In high schooling costs, when children repeat grade, when they need special services, in the high costs of social services, in the high costs of crime. And the high costs of crime include not only the costs to the government of police and criminal justice system, the courts and prisons, but the costs to the public, the costs of being a victim of crime, the cost of being a victim of violence, the costs of having to hire private security. These costs turn out to be tremendous. And one of my jobs over the last 30 years as an economist has been to try to quantify just how large those costs are, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail. But first I want to talk about what size impacts we can produce. At the Institute, we conducted a statistical summary of all of the research in the United States since 1960. And we found 123 studies that we could summarize and not give you our opinion about what are the effects, what did we think work, what did we think not work, but a pure statistical summary. So these are the numbers, it's not our interpretation of them. And we've standardized everything in terms of of a common effect size. It's a little hard to explain what that means, although it has a very precise statistical meaning. But in real life terms, the gap between children in poverty and other children, between disadvantaged minority children and other children in the United States, is an effect size of about 1. Right? So you can interpret these effect sizes as what percentage of the gap between low-income and higher-income children was closed by the program. So, on average, the initial impacts of these programs are to close about 70% of the achievement gap. If we look a little longer term, short term, and longer term, it's about half that. So, do these programs permanently close 70% of the achievement gap? No. They permanently close about 1/3 of the achievement gap. They're not magic. Poor children are still poor. Right? So we don't change that. What we change is the education in the first 5 years of poor children. These things have more than just cognitive impacts. They have impacts on social emotional behavior, impacts on schooling. And these impacts might look small, so we're talking about closing maybe 15% of the achievement gap on average. 15% of the gap in terms of social behavior, 15% of the gap in terms of high school graduation. But those relatively small impacts turn out to have large value. The other thing to pay attention to is, of course, these are just average. So we asked the question, how much larger would effects be if programs were well designed? That is, if we looked at the programs that were stronger rather than just the average, how long would effects would be? And those cognitive effects are the ones in parentheses. So about 90% of the achievement gap can be closed initially, and half the achievement gap permanently. We did further analysis on just this point of what makes the difference between these larger effects and the average. And what we find about what mattered in the US is programs that had direct teaching, that focused primarily on teaching the child, had larger effects than those that didn't. Programs that focused on individualization, the teacher working one-on-one with the child, and on the teacher working with small groups, had larger effects. And comprehensive programs that addressed health, nutrition, social services for families were less effective. Now, this isn't what you might expect, but I think we have to ask, so we had to ask, why would this be the case? And I think the answer is because those programs dilute their efforts, and they end up not doing any of those things particularly well. Every country, even the United States, is relatively high income, has to prioritize resources, and they're not unlimited. And if you spread your resources too thin, I think what you see is you end up with less effective programs. Now, from other studies beyond the meta-analysis, if we look into detail into some of the studies, we find things that are not so surprising. Children learn what they're taught. If you have a program that only focuses on reading, on math, on science, that's what they learn. They don't learn how to behave. They don't learn to take responsibility for their own actions. They don't learn to think before they act. All of these things are the kinds of things that are important for preventing crime. So you can have programs that make people more successful in school, but don't necessarily keep them from participating in crime and violence. Educated, well-trained, and adequately paid staff are one of the keys to more effective programs. And finally, quality, quality, quality. I'm going to talk more about what do I mean by quality, but it has to do with the interactions between the adults and the children and the kinds of interactions and activities that the adults plan for the children. Now you saw earlier from Milagros Norris international results from a similar kind of meta-analysis, same kinds of effect sizes. So these are short and medium term, and remember, on average in the US you closed about 1/3 of the achievement gap, and you can see these effect sizes internationally are all about the same size. So as we look across the world, we do not see a different pattern of results. We see very much the same kinds of results as we do in the United States. To make that more concrete, I want to take you halfway around the world to a small low-income country called Mauritius. A group of medical doctors were interested in preventing mental health problems. And they wanted to do that by focusing, they thought if we focus on education and nutrition in the preschool years, we can really change adult mental health. They had no broader view than that, but they collected broader data, and it turns out that was a good thing. They created an intervention focused on nutrition, education, and exercise for children 3 to 5. Now, Mauritius has a French system of education, so they offer to many children a preschool program like the École Maternelle in France. But they have one teacher poorly trained for every 30 children. What they did was put well-trained teachers in classes where they had 2 teachers for every 11 children, so 1 teacher for every 5 to 6 children. It's a vast change, and they added a stronger nutritional component. Well, what did they find? They found that not only did children do better in school, but when they followed them up between the ages of 17 and 23, there were fewer children who had diagnosed behavior problems, fewer children who had conduct disorder, less crime, and less mental illness. These are the same kinds of effects we found from the same kinds of programs in the United States, in France, in Australia, in a variety of developed countries with somewhat, perhaps even quite different cultures, yet you see the same kinds of results. And I think this indicates what we're looking at when we intervene in the education of children before the age of 5 is something that is fundamentally altering the human condition, something that's much more broadly about us as people, and not so much as about our particular social and economic circumstances. So, I'm an economist. I got into this field because I was interested in the economics of investing in human capital. The first study I ever worked on was the high-scope paired preschool study. I started this during my doctoral work at the University of Michigan. When I began, this is a study that began in the early 1960s. When I started, they were analyzing data from the age 19 follow-up. I'm not all that much older than the children in the paired preschool study. Hope to be around for their retirement study. We're working on the age 50 follow-up now. It is the longest follow-up of an investment in early childhood development. It's a randomized trial like we are conducting here in Colombia. We started off with a lottery to create 2 groups that were equal. One got the program, one didn't. We followed them every year through the beginning of school, then again at age 15.